Hello and welcome to this video. My name's Beckham. I was recently asked by a local camera club to give a talk, and the subject was creating the wow value. I think before we start we may have to just say a few words about what we think is the wow value. Well, I'm giving a talk to a photographic club. We generally know the standard of those clubs is pretty good. So I think when we say here we're looking to create the wow value, what we're doing is trying to create images that maybe are a bit above average, those images that hopefully are going to score pretty well if they were entered into camera club competitions, and who knows, if we get everything right we get a high score like a 10. Now of course that's a pretty lofty aim, but there's nothing wrong with aiming high. But when we start to think about how we actually create the wow value, it's not one single thing that we do. It's a number of small steps that we take sometimes before we've even left home, and it ranges right the way through to when we present the image in the camera club setting. Everything has a bearing on the end result. Where we decide to go, assuming we're going out to take pictures, what time we decide to go there, where our shooting position is. Are we shooting from standing up? Are we getting down low and shooting from the ground, which can make a significant difference? Do we walk 10 feet up the bank or down into the hollow to get a different type of shot? All those things are going to impact on the image and affect the wow value. Composition is important, focus is important, the technical issues are important. Exposure is the biggie, and of course image editing plays a large part too. Added together they add up to the wow value. Now one of the problems we have to navigate as we go through those series of small steps to the wow value is image editing. Even in camera clubs there are very many people who have great difficulty in shaking the thought that image editing is somehow wrong. When I do have someone come up to me at a demonstration and they do start to tell me how they feel that image editing is wrong, that tells me one important thing. It tells me that the person talking to me doesn't really understand the photographic medium. They don't understand what their camera can capture and how that differs with what we see. And I did hear something once which I think fits this perfectly. Many people have enough experience and knowledge of a subject to believe they're right, but not quite enough knowledge to know they could be wrong. Of course, photography is an art. We use our image editing to express ourselves, but we do have to learn to be able to do that. When you think about it, nothing of value ever comes without some effort, and as soon as it does, then that loses the value. I think photographers are pretty good at learning the technicalities. We certainly do get tied up quite a bit with image editing, but sitting over the top of all of those is another skill which I think is a little bit harder to come by, and that's knowing what makes a good picture. Image editing is a bit like driving a car. We don't change our driving habits because we're driving a different make of car today. The rules of the road and our driving style tend to remain the same. Well, image editing is exactly the same too. I'm a Photoshop user and have been for some time, so I can always find one or two different techniques which make it stand out from the crowd in my opinion, but generally speaking, when we edit our images we're doing the same thing no matter what software we were using. Now one of the problems we have to overcome is we have to bridge the gap between what we're able to capture with our camera and what we see with our eyes, and of course what we can create in our image editor. And if I can make a car analogy again, and it's to do with this understanding what makes a good picture. If we can't find a route to travel somewhere, then our sat-nav in the car is useless. So think of this as an image editing project. If I know for a fact that I need to go to a store, and the store is to the west of the business district of Brisbane, I can start driving in that general direction. I can hope that when I get close I have a bit of inspiration, or I can stop and ask someone where the store is. But if I don't know where the store is located at all, then how do I know which direction to set off? And image editing, I think, is very similar to that. Now, I'm not suggesting that when we sit down with a raw file, we're always knowing exactly what we're going to do. We often head off, let's say, a bit northwest and end up going over to northeast as inspiration kicks in. We do get rather tied up with the technical stuff, as I have suggested earlier, and certainly with image editing. And we don't pay enough attention, in my view, to what makes a good image, because we need this skill at the time we're pressing the button and when we're sitting in front of the computer with a thumbnail ready to start the editing process. So here I'm showing you an untouched raw image. We can tell an awful lot about the image just by looking at the technical data that I've reproduced at the top left. We can see some movement in the sea there, so it's odds on that this image is going to be shot from a tripod, but when we see the shutter speed of 1/6 of a second, we know that this was definitely shot from a tripod. The ISO has been kept low, and the small aperture has allowed the slow shutter speed to capture the movement in the water. No problem there, but you'll also see +1. What I've chosen to do here is what's commonly called these days exposing to the right. I've squeezed one more stop of light into the sensor, greater than the camera was prepared to give, so I've actually doubled the exposure. Now that's had an impact on the image, of course. It makes it look a little bit weak, insipid and pale, but in actual fact everything I need is within that shot. And I think this is a pretty good example of the gap I was talking about between what we capture and eventually what we can produce. This image is exactly the same as the one you saw. Nothing has been copied in from another image. Every pixel that's here was in the previous image too. We just needed to bring out what was within the picture using our image editing skills, but remember, they are just like driving a car, because most of the time they're pretty routine. So if we accept that creating the wow value is a series of small steps, I did manage to capture a reasonably sized step by creating the exposure you can see here. So with one of the vital steps to the wow value met, the exposure, we're most of the way there. And remember, photography is an art. Now here's an unusual topic for me. This image was shot quite a long time ago. It's an untouched raw file, quite ordinary. You can see that I must have been hand holding when I shot this image, because you can tell that from 1600 ISO, 320th of a second at f8, but once again you can see that I've squeezed a bit more light into the image, because if I do my image editing and I'm moving all those sliders from light pixels to dark, I've got far more leeway than if I underexpose any of this shot and I have to raise detail from those areas. In fact, if you want the very best way to defeat noise from having to use a high ISO, it's do not underexpose. Now the red oblong there shows you the part of the image I decided to use. Not a very large part of this image, as you can see, probably about 1/10 of it at a guess. Now I very rarely do this because I'm not a great fan of this, because what I'm going to end up with is not going to be super quality, is it? If I really wanted this shot, I should have come in really much closer and used a tripod and captured more of it as a full frame shot. But on this occasion, after seeing that thumbnail lots of times over the years, I just happened to find it as I was looking for something else one day, and the idea came to me. What I've actually done here is removed clarity in Adobe Camera Raw. Now generally we're pushing the clarity up to add mid-tone contrast to give our images that appearance of greater sharpness and more impact. But here, using it in reverse seems to have worked quite well. And all I've done really is a little bit of spotting. There's a few dead insects inside the flower. But there we have an image almost from nothing. But we have to visualize it when we sit in front of the thumbnail. Here's another typical raw image from the area where I live. Not likely to attract that much attention as a thumbnail if it was viewed in Bridge or in Lightroom amongst many others. But in fact, all of the ingredients are there, either color or mono. As you'll see in a moment or two, I decided to create this as a monochrome, probably because I do have a love of monochrome coming from darkroom days, where that's where I cut my teeth on image editing, in the darkroom with black and white negatives. So I think I do lean towards black and white more than some. The technical data tells us quite a bit here, but not a great deal different from the previous seascape, because we've got a 1 second shutter speed to create the movement, and I've been able to do that by stopping down the aperture to f22, and obviously we're on a tripod at 100 ISO. I haven't given this image any more exposure, but I could have done. Well, in fact I did at the time, but I'm just showing you the image which was created by the camera's exposure meter. I took a series of 3, but I used just this one to produce the image I'm about to show. I have been asked what drives the decision to make a monochrome or a black and white. In my case, I think there probably is some bias from the days when I worked in the darkroom, but I do like black and whites. But if I start to work on an image and I don't think the color is adding a great deal, then I tend to move to a monochrome and try that. Here's another raw, untouched image. The first thing I draw your attention to is you can see the blue cast on the bodywork of the cars. So the entire color balance has been knocked off. So we do need to correct that before we start our image editing, because that's affecting the warm tones. It's making them a little weaker too. It's a landscape with a telephoto lens, 400mm, so you can see why a 400th of a second was used. This was being handheld, and there's a good guide when you're using a telephoto lens. Try to keep the shutter speed at least equal with the focal length of the lens you're using. Now here I used 3 bracketed shots, and I made a raw HDR image in Adobe Camera Raw. HDR, High Dynamic Range. So I'm blending 3 images together. You could argue, given the light conditions, well, maybe I didn't need to do that. The one good thing about HDR these days, in my view, I can stitch 3 images together in Adobe Camera Raw, but at the end of the exercise I still have a raw file. So I can have all the benefits of high dynamic range without any of the negatives of HDR of the past. And sometimes those negatives with HDRs were that you could tell it was a HDR image from 100 yards away. When we edit our images, most of them, especially if we're shooting RAW these days, are going to require global editing. Global editing is those changes we make which affect the whole of the image. Exposure, color, contrast, maybe straightening verticals and leveling up the horizon, that sort of thing. But many images also need strategic editing as well. They need another part of the image changed in a different way, via an adjustment brush maybe a graduated filter or a circular filter. And some images need that global editing, strategic editing, and also final touches in Photoshop. And what I've done here is to turn on the lights of all of the cars, because in the original the lights of the center one was on and it just didn't look quite right in the finished image, and that of course is a simple copy and paste. Now here's another untouched raw image which I've been looking at on and off since 2013, and I remember it well. A friend of mine was staying in Australia from the UK, and I took her down to the coast to witness the Sunshine Coast of Australia. Well, you can see the weather we had, it was pretty awful. All you're looking at here is the slats on a stainless steel bench on Mooloolaba seafront. I was hand holding, hence 60th of a second at f8, and I've pushed the ISO up just a little bit just so that I don't suffer any camera shake. But as you can see, the image looks pretty dire, but we have to bridge the gap. And here's a thought too. Once we gain a little bit more experience on knowing where we're going to go with an image, it affects what we shoot. Because if I asked the question, was this worth a shot? On the strength of it, many people would perhaps say, probably not. But I must have seen something. This is the image that I managed to create with the one you've just seen. I had to work a bit harder with contrast, colour, clarity, but I'm pretty confident I've got the wow value. So when I'm out with my camera and I take a shot and I look at it on the back of the camera, I'm not looking at it to try to identify the wow value already. I'm trying to make sure that I've got all the ingredients within that file to do something with it when I get it back and on the computer. In some ways it's very much the same as what I used to do in the darkroom years ago. Capture a black and white negative that would give me the best chance of getting a large 2016 print at the best quality I can. I do much the same process these days, but we just work digitally. This image is one image of a bracketed set of 3, taken mainly because the contrast is quite high. I've got a choice here. I can expose for the sky to get that light area nice and dark and colourful and lose the foreground, or I can expose for the foreground and I can lose the sky. Well, in actual fact I took 3 exposures, and what I did was to use the sky from one shot with the foreground from the other. So if we're going to produce a shot from contrasty conditions from 2 different exposures, then we're going to need camera raw. We're going to need to open the images up in Photoshop and to use layers and layer masks. But it's a pretty easy technique which sounds far more complex than it actually is. So good images with the wow value are created with a number of small, generally insignificant steps. But I'm always looking for something a little different, and that's why a year or 2 ago I had a little dabble with infrared photography. This is Buderim Botanical Gardens, a little bit of colour added in the water and into the tree, but the infrared medium just allows you to create something a little different. So the wow value really does hinge on capturing a good exposure at the start, and we need that good exposure to arrive at a dynamic image at the end that retains good quality. It needs to be sharp, well exposed, good contrast, good editing, good presentation. The talk that this recording has come from was given to a camera club on the Sunshine Coast of Australia. and I was saying to them that we tend to bombard our photographic judges and colleagues in the club with seascapes because of where we live. And I was suggesting, like the infrared shots previously, that sometimes we just need to place something different in front of our judges to make them stand out. The techniques I use to create these images is open to practically anyone watching this video. The light source behind all of these glass images is simply a flat screen monitor. Throw up an image on the monitor, stand the glass in front, that's it. To bring this video to a close, let me show you one more image which I think has the wow value in bucket loads. But it wasn't actually created as a camera club image to put in competitions at all. It was created to demonstrate the concept of Photoshop's layers. The picture I took of one wooden life-size soldier against a fussy background has allowed me to use this to demonstrate not only how we can remove a complex subject from a fussy background and do it quickly and efficiently, but also how to demonstrate how layers in Photoshop work. And this was one of the images. In fact, I still use it. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. At least you stayed to the end, so that's a good sign. Can I tempt you to stay just another minute? Because I have something to show you which may be of interest. Each month I create a newsletter on a photographic and audio-visual subjects, and I always include a video for you to download or view on YouTube. These are full-screen HD videos, just like this one you're watching here. So if you'd like to be included on my mailing list, just drop me an email to the address you can see on screen, and that's it. I'll put you on my list. The newsletter is created as a PDF, so it's very quick and easy to open. I also produce a number of audio-visual presentations that are free to download. These are just a small fraction of what I have. You get to see more of my photography with a bit of entertainment mixed in. Just follow the audio-visual menu on my website, look for presentations, and you'll find those, the software to create the audio-visual, and lots of video tutorials on how we do it. One of the video sets that I'm most proud of is Photoshop for photographers, because it's a complete video course. It contains 58 videos in 7 parts. The first part is completely free, and that is 14 videos that run themselves for over 2 hours. And I offer a bonus of 60 Lightroom videos when you purchase all 6 parts. If you're watching on YouTube, there are links below in the Show More section, and don't forget to subscribe.